Hello, thanks for joining me here on France 24. Well, Samantha Power is my guest today. She was the youngest ever U.S. ambassador to the UN when Barack Obama appointed her in 2013. She's a former war correspondent, a human rights defender. Ambassador Power has actually been described as the moral compass of American diplomacy at a time when moral compasses may seem in very short supply on the world's diplomatic stage. She's here just over a month before she relinquishes her post to Donald Trump's appointed successor, the South Carolina Governor Nikki Haley. It's also a turbulent time, obviously, on the diplomatic stage. Thanks for being here this morning.
Great to be here.
I'm going to cut to the chase that has been dominating your job since you came in 2013, Syria. As I speak here today, we are seeing the rebels routed from their last bastions of eastern Aleppo. We heard the Russian foreign minister the other day, Sergei Lavrov, basically say, those who leave nicely will not be destroyed. Is the war over? Has Bashar Assad won?
I think the reason the conflict started in the first place was that people rose up with great discontent over the leadership provided by Assad. And that was before he had gassed his own people, systematically tortured people in his prisons, laid siege to Aleppo in one of the most brutal acts of war that we've seen, I think, in our lifetimes. So, if you're going to govern a country, you've got to have some kind of modus vivendi with the people who actually live in the country. And this kind of brutality, you can take territory, it turns out, particularly when you're backed by Russia, Iran, Hezbollah, in savage ways. But to actually win the loyalty of the people and actually have the kind of calm that we need, both in order for the sake of the people in Syria and for the sake of regional stability, but also in order to sustainably defeat the terrorists that all of us have an interest in seeing vanquished, there's going to have to be a political solution. So what you've seen now is a chapter of the war where Russia and Syria have gone all in on behalf of a military solution, even as they still talk about a political solution. But it's not a sustainable approach.
Former U.S. ambassador to Croatia, Peter Galbraith, he wrote yesterday in the New York Times, he basically said, you could denounce all you want the atrocities in Syria. It's not going to change one iota the situation on the ground. Is the U.S. now bound to work, even collaborate with both Putin and maybe even Bashar Assad for a time?
Well, we've been trying, as you know, for years. I mean, really since the beginning of this horrific conflict, to work with Russia. We believe our interests actually are relatively aligned. None of us want to see terrorists. None of us want to see refugees spilling into other countries, the kind of instability that causes. And again, rhetorically, we've all been agreed on the need for a political solution. But what they do on the ground is go all in on behalf of military force. And so I think the general contours of what it is we should be doing with Russia, we have no disagreement that that's where cooperation needs to be found. That's what makes the UN Security Council functional. That's what makes the global order functional. But I wouldn't look to the United States as the country that has walked away from diplomacy. It's the Russian Federation that's done that.
You're a diplomat. I understand you have to obviously exercise some restraint here, but I imagine, just personally, it must be extremely frustrating with you. How many vetoes have you faced from Russia or China?
I believe 6 and counting. Yes.
6 and counting, and each time you have to put on a poker face and you have to sort of just plow through.
Poker face is not my strong suit, but
right. Well, and
I mean, look, the having a seat on the UN Security Council is an incredible privilege. Dates back to World War II, and when you have a conflict that is probably exhibit A of the last couple decades of threat to international peace and security, and you have a veto-wielding permanent member of the Security Council that uses and abuses its veto in this way. I mean, this is not only bad for the Syrian people, but it's bad for the international order. The consequences, though, are not just about international order. They're about those people that you have depicted fleeing eastern Aleppo, their terror, all the loved ones that have been lost, the schools, the hospitals, the markets that have been destroyed. I mean, it's the human consequences of this war that are devastating.
And you're right, Samantha Power. We have all seen those images, and they are horrific. You have said yourself, in no uncertain terms, what Russia is sponsoring in Syria is not counterterrorism, as they maintain. It is barbarism. Can there be, under the limits of the Security Council, any accountability for what comes next to Vladimir Putin and to Bashar Assad?
Well, so far, we and France and others a couple of years ago came forward and put a vote before the Security Council on a referral to the International Criminal Court, which, when you have a government like Syria that is clearly unwilling to prosecute its own, even if they're carrying out crimes against humanity and war crimes, you know, that's why we have an ICC. It's why we have an International Criminal Court. Russia, of course, vetoed, one of the 6 vetoes. But I think that it would be a mistake on the part of the perpetrators to think that history has only a short-term memory. I mean, we've seen in other conflicts that people who are strutting around feeling like they can do no wrong or can do wrong and not be held accountable, later the evidence gets amassed and politics change, global dynamics change, and they find themselves in the docket. So our job now, above all, is to try to end the conflict and, you know, look under every stone to see if there's some kind of compromise that can be forged, try to get a safe and orderly evacuation of people who want to leave eastern Aleppo, try to get food in, all the obvious things we've been trying to do for some time. At the same time, we should be gathering evidence for some future day of accountability.
So keeping the eye sort of on the long-term picture a little more, you had said at one point, I believe it was after the first widely reported use of chemical weapons in Syria, the Security Council that we need to deal with this crisis is not the Security Council we have. As you prepare to leave this position, what sort of Security Council do you want to see? What does the world need to effectively deal with a crisis like Syria?
Well, I'd say a couple things. One, while Syria is the biggest black mark on the Security Council's record, on the international community's response, the Security Council has continued to be functional in a whole host of other areas. You know, when it comes to a lot of the African issues, there's an ability to deploy peacekeepers or even employ economic sanctions, an ability to unite. And when we unite, we're actually pretty effective, particularly when you have Russia, China, the United States, France, and the United Kingdom, you know, singing from the same songbook. So Syria really stands out as a glaring exception to a rule of not full functionality. It's not like we're ending conflict everywhere it exists in the world, but at least
dysfunctionality.
But it is Exhibit A of the blockage by virtue of the veto.
Could I just jump in? You're here in Paris. Obviously, you were attending the Open Government Conference. You also visited a refugee center here, slightly changing the topic, but not really, because the Syrian war has spawned the refugee crisis. France had a lot of refugees. It's had a lot of a difficult time dealing with them. What were your impressions? What are your impressions in general of how France is dealing with the refugee influx, but also Europe on a broader scale?
Well, given that we have 65 million displaced people, more than at any time since the Second World War, it's imperative on all of us to do more than business as usual. And I think what the refugee center that the mayor, Hidalgo, has set up here in Paris is a very impressive example of kind of fresh thinking, trying to actually absorb those who come in a more orderly way. We need to look out, of course, for the security imperative. Paris has suffered terribly over the course of the last year, as has Nice here in France. And I know people have a lot of fear of people who are just coming in from conflict areas who haven't been through proper processes. The center that's been set up allows for that kind of vetting to occur, allows people in a more orderly way to apply for asylum. And at a human level, people we met with yesterday had traveled, often everyone we met with, in fact, had traveled for more than a year, you know, across, you know, through boat dinghies, you know, drawing on smugglers who couldn't have cared less about their fates, walking by foot, bus, train, sleeping out in the cold. This center here in Paris, which just opened in November, was the first time many of them had had a hot meal again since they left their home countries. First time many of them had been able to even bathe themselves or get a clean set of clothes. So I think from a humanitarian standpoint, it's very important that such mechanisms get set up, that it isn't this just stream of this flow of people who are so desperate. From a strategic standpoint, also, it's important, again, that countries are cooperating, that everybody's part of a systemic response. And as you know, some countries have opted out of being part of that kind of arrangement. But I think while that may be appealing to the sort of populist, you know, move that is afoot in a lot of different countries, and while there are very legitimate fears that people have about a whole wave of people coming into their countries, it's short-sighted to think that you can just build walls and expect the problem to go away. I mean, it does nobody in the world any favors from a security standpoint if you have people just flowing into Lebanon or to Turkey, living without the means to survive, without the food, without the shelter, overburdening systems that are already at their breaking points. This is a burden that's going to have to be shared. And, of course, the number one way to deal with the refugee crisis is to deal with these conflicts at their source, which gets back to Russia and whether or not.
Samantha Power, in the little time we have left, you mentioned building walls. I'm going to just ask you, Donald Trump coming in, president-elect, he's already appointed your successor, South Carolina Governor Nikki Haley. She's been described by someone who worked with her at the state level in state politics as perhaps the least experienced U.S. ambassador ever appointed to the United Nations. Won't ask you to judge her, but I will ask, what advice would you give to someone like that coming in with such little experience? Can she learn on the job?
Well, a lot of people have been asking me about different dimensions of the future Trump presidency, and it's very hard to speculate. There are a lot of people who come from very different walks of life, so to predict on any particular policy issue would not be my job, and it's actually would be very, very hard to do. I think my number one piece of advice to anybody coming in is to draw on the incredible resources that exist within the U.S. government that are there, whether it's George W. Bush, Barack Obama. If it had been Hillary Clinton, it will be now Donald Trump. 90% of my team, for instance, in New York, is career foreign service, career civil service. They've been through the ebb and flow. They stay no matter who is running the mission. And, anytime I look smart, it's because my team has equipped me. I think there's a ton of travel involved in the job. You get out there with your own eyes. It's not dissimilar to being in public life of any kind. Every day there's a new challenge that's put before you that you got to get smart on in a hurry, and you go to the smartest people you know.
So she's going to have to rely on a competent team, competent people around her. Samantha Power, we could talk all day. I'm really sorry. We have run out of time. Outgoing U.S. Ambassador to the UN, Samantha Power, thank you very much for being here today. A little more than 5 weeks left in the job. I suspect you'll be busy in those final 5 weeks.
Absolutely.
Thanks again, and you're back to New York. And thanks to all of you for watching the interview here on France 24.